What if the most powerful empire the world has ever seen began with a starving orphan boy, abandoned to die alone on the frozen grasslands of Siberia? How did a people with no cities, no salaries, no permanent walls, and armies a fraction the size of their enemies bring China, Persia, and Europe to their knees within a single human lifetime? This is the entire history of the Mongol Empire, 1206 to 1368, and it begins with blood already on his hands. Life on the Mongolian steppe was never gentle, not for anyone, not for any clan. Every single day was a war against the cold, against starvation, and against rival families who would slaughter you without hesitation for grazing land, for water, for livestock. There was no safety net out here, no government, no walls, no granary to fall back on when the season turned cruel. There was only the herd, the horse, and the blade at your hip. Survival itself was the only law of the land. Into this unforgiving world, a boy was born clutching a small clot of blood tightly in his tiny fist. The shamans who witnessed the birth whispered that this was an omen, a sign that this child was destined to become a warrior unlike any the steppe had ever produced before. His parents named him Temüjin, after a defeated enemy chieftain his father had just captured in battle, a name meant to symbolize strength taken from a fallen rival. When Temüjin was only 9 years old, his father, a minor chieftain named Ögedei, was poisoned by members of a rival clan, the Tatars, during what was supposed to be a peaceful shared meal along the road. It was an act of calculated treachery, the kind the steppe was infamous for. With their protector gone, and seeing no further benefit in supporting a fatherless family, Temüjin's own clan turned its back entirely. They abandoned his mother and siblings in the middle of the open grassland, leaving them with no horses, no protection, and no food, expecting them to die quietly of exposure and hunger within the season. To survive that first brutal winter and the desperate years that followed, Temüjin and his family ate field rodents, dug for wild roots beneath the frozen soil, and fished in icy rivers with crude tools. The desperation cut even deeper than hunger, though. In a moment that still divides historians today, Temüjin killed his own older half-brother, Begta, during a violent dispute over a stolen fish and a small bird the family had caught, eliminating a rival for control of the family's painfully meager resources and asserting himself as its true head. Soon after, Temüjin was captured by a rival clan and forced into a heavy wooden slave collar, paraded as a humiliated prisoner from camp to camp. He endured beatings, starvation, and came dangerously close to execution on more than one occasion, before managing a daring escape under cover of darkness. But every single trial taught him something the steppe's old aristocracy never fully understood. Loyalty had to be earned through demonstrated ability, not simply inherited through bloodline or noble birth. Slowly, painstakingly, he began gathering followers, not because of who his father had been, but because of what he personally could offer them: protection, plunder, and a future. That single lesson, forged in childhood suffering, would one day become the very foundation of the largest land empire the world has ever known. Beyond mere survival, these years taught Temüjin something darker and far more useful: the precise mechanics of betrayal itself. He had watched his own people abandon a widow and her children without a second thought the moment it became politically convenient. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else alive on the steppe at that moment, that blood ties and ancient custom meant absolutely nothing once self-interest entered the equation. Power, he concluded, belonged only to whoever was strong enough and clever enough to seize and hold it. His escape from captivity became something of a local legend in its own right. Hiding in a riverbed, submerged in icy water, with only his nostrils above the surface, he evaded search parties for hours, until nightfall finally allowed him to slip away unnoticed. A sympathetic herder named Sorkan Shira, who had once treated him kindly during his captivity, secretly helped conceal him and provided him with a horse, a bow, and a small amount of food. The very first true allies Temüjin had ever earned through nothing but genuine, personal trust. By his late teens, Temüjin had also forged a crucial alliance with Togrul, the powerful Khan of the neighboring Karaite Confederation, who had once been blood brothers with his late father. This relationship would provide young Temüjin with both protection and legitimacy during his most vulnerable years, even as it would later become one of the bitterest rivalries of his entire rise to power, since Togrul would eventually turn against him once his former protégé's ambitions grew too large to control. Even his marriage carried the marks of steppe violence from the very start. His wife Borta was kidnapped by Möngke raiders shortly after their wedding, a deeply personal humiliation that Temüjin would spend years plotting to avenge. When he finally rescued her with the help of his allies, she was already pregnant, and the paternity of their first son, Jochi, would remain a source of quiet family tension for the rest of both their lives, a wound that never fully healed even as their empire grew to encompass half the known world. Years later, when Temüjin finally led his own war party to rescue Borta from the Möngke camp, the victory marked his first true demonstration of large-scale, coordinated command, gathering allied forces from multiple clans under a single battle plan. It was a small campaign by the standards of what would follow, but it taught him invaluable lessons about alliance building, surprise, and decisive battlefield timing that would echo throughout every major conquest still to come. Through decades of patient alliances, painful betrayals, and the methodical destruction of every rival power on the steppe, the Tatars who had murdered his father, the Merkits who had once kidnapped his wife, and the powerful Naimans who refused to bow, Temüjin accomplished something no single leader on the steppe had managed in centuries. He unified every scattered Mongol and Turkic-speaking tribe under one single banner, ending generations of endless tribal warfare. In the year 1206, a great assembly of chieftains, known as the Kurultai, gathered on the open steppe and formally declared him Genghis Khan, a title most often translated as Universal Ruler or Oceanic Khan, reflecting the boundless scope of authority now placed in his hands. The boy who had once been left to starve in the open grass now commanded every horse, every warrior, and every clan across the entire Mongolian plateau. His very first act as supreme ruler was nothing short of radical for his time and place. He abolished the old tribal clan system entirely, the very structure that had once left his family for dead in their darkest hour, and reorganized the entire army on a strict decimal system instead. Units of 10 men were called an arban. Units of 100 were called a zun. Units of 1,000 were called a mingan, and the largest formations, 10,000 strong, were called a tumen. Loyalty now flowed not to a bloodline or a clan elder, but directly to the unit, to the commander, and ultimately to the Khan himself. Discipline within this new army was absolute and unforgiving. If a single soldier within a unit of 10 fled the battlefield in cowardice, all 9 of his remaining comrades were executed without exception or appeal, regardless of their own conduct in the fight. There was no room left for individual cowardice, because cowardice now endangered the lives of everyone standing beside you, not just your own. And yet, remarkably, alongside this brutal military discipline, Genghis Khan also created something startlingly progressive for the 13th century. He established a universal code of law known as the Yasa, applicable to every subject within his growing domain. It strictly banned the kidnapping of women, criminalized the theft of livestock under penalty of death, and most surprisingly of all, guaranteed religious freedom to every person living under Mongol rule, regardless of their personal faith or background. The same man who burned cities to the ground also built a legal framework that, in some respects, was centuries ahead of its time. Genghis Khan also understood, with remarkable clarity for a leader from a purely oral culture, the value of skilled administration over raw conquest alone. He adopted the Uyghur script to give the Mongol language its first written form, ordered that his sons and grandsons be taught to read, and began recruiting literate officials from conquered peoples, Chinese, Persian, and Uyghur alike, to help manage the growing complexity of an empire that no longer fit inside any single person's memory. He also restructured the elite imperial guard, known as the Keshig, drawing its members directly from the sons of loyal commanders and nobles across the unified tribes. This was simultaneously an honor and a hostage system, binding the new aristocracy to the throne through both privilege and implicit leverage, ensuring that rebellion against the Khan would mean risking the lives of one's own children serving at court. Trade and merit were elevated above bloodline at every level of this new society. Talented commoners could rise to command tumens of 10,000 men if they proved their loyalty and skill in battle, a level of social mobility almost unimaginable anywhere else in the 13th century world, where birth alone typically determined a person's entire destiny from the moment they were born. This new system also demanded total subordination of personal identity to the collective war machine. Soldiers no longer fought primarily for their original clan or birthplace, but for the unit standing beside them and the empire above them both. It was a psychological transformation as significant as any weapon or tactic the Mongols ever developed, turning fiercely independent steppe warriors, who had spent generations raiding one another, into the most cohesive fighting force the medieval world had ever witnessed. This new unified army also incorporated conquered peoples surprisingly quickly into its ranks, so long as they demonstrated loyalty and competence. Turkic tribes, defeated rivals, and even captured foreign soldiers were often absorbed directly into Mongol units within a single generation, diluting any sense of pure ethnic exclusivity and instead building something closer to a meritocratic military brotherhood bound by shared conquest rather than shared ancestry alone. With resources growing scarce on the steppe and old historical grievances still unresolved, Genghis Khan turned his formidable new army toward the Yuan Dynasty, which ruled over northern China and commanded a population numbering in the tens of millions, vastly outnumbering the Mongols by every possible measure. The problem facing the invaders was straightforward but serious. Mongols were unmatched on open ground, true masters of mounted archery and rapid maneuver, but they had absolutely no experience breaching the massive fortified cities that dotted the Chinese landscape. So they adapted quickly and ruthlessly. They captured skilled Chinese engineers and forced them, under threat of death, to teach the secrets of siege warfare, including the construction and operation of catapults, battering rams, and complex techniques of city encirclement. Their battlefield tactics soon turned genuinely horrifying by any standard. Captured civilians were frequently driven forward directly in front of advancing Mongol soldiers, forced to serve as living human shields, absorbing arrows and projectiles that would otherwise have struck the army marching behind them. Mongol forces also became masters of starvation siege warfare, deliberately cutting off every supply line into a city until the trapped population descended into desperation and, in several horrifying documented cases, cannibalism. long before the walls were ever actually breached by force. In the year 1215, the great Jin capital of Zhongdu, the very site where modern Beijing now stands, finally fell after a prolonged and agonizing siege. The city was thoroughly sacked and burned to the ground, and hundreds of thousands of its residents were slaughtered in the aftermath. Northern China, one of the wealthiest and most populous regions on the entire planet at the time, would never fully recover its former glory under Jin rule again. The fall of Zhongdu sent shockwaves across the entire region, reaching the ears of rulers as far away as Persia and Europe within just a few years. Survivors describe streets littered with the dead for months afterward, and foreign merchants who passed through the ruins reported that the ground itself had turned greasy with human fat from the sheer scale of the slaughter, a detail repeated in multiple independent historical chronicles of the period. Genghis Khan did not personally oversee every detail of this campaign, instead delegating much of the actual siege warfare to trusted generals, while he focused on the broader strategic picture, dividing his forces into 3 separate columns that swept across northern China simultaneously, overwhelming the Jin defenses through speed and coordination, rather than relying on any single decisive battle. Critically, the Mongols did not simply destroy everything in their path during this campaign. They specifically spared skilled craftsmen, engineers, and administrators wherever possible, recognizing early on that conquest without competent governance would eventually collapse under its own weight. This pattern, destroy the resistance but preserve the useful, would repeat itself again and again throughout the decades of expansion still to come. The Jin court itself, paralyzed by internal political infighting even as their cities burned, never managed to mount the kind of unified counterattack that might have driven the invaders back beyond their northern borders. Several Jin generals reportedly defected outright to the Mongol side, offering their knowledge of fortifications and troop movements in exchange for amnesty, a pattern of internal betrayal that would weaken nearly every empire the Mongols ever targeted throughout their long campaign of conquest. The northern Chinese campaign also forced Genghis Khan to confront, for the very first time, the genuine limits of pure cavalry warfare. Unlike the open steppe battles he had mastered as a young man, the dense network of fortified Chinese cities demanded patience, engineering knowledge, and an entirely new approach to logistics that his earlier tribal wars had never required. The lessons learned here, painfully and at enormous cost in time and manpower, would directly shape every subsequent siege his armies undertook across Persia, Russia, and the Middle East in the decades that followed. Genghis Khan did not always seek war as his first option. In this particular case, he initially sought peaceful trade relations with the powerful Khwarezmian Empire, which stretched across vast territories of Persia and Central Asia, and he sent a large caravan of 500 merchants westward to formally open diplomatic and commercial relations between the two powers. The governor of the border city of Otrar, perhaps motivated by simple greed, accused these merchants of espionage on flimsy pretext, seized their considerable goods for himself, and had every single one of them executed without trial. When Genghis Khan responded by sending 3 official diplomats to demand justice and an explanation, the Khwarezmian Shah responded with even greater contempt. He had the lead envoy executed outright, and shaved the heads of the other 2 diplomats in deliberate humiliation before sending them home in utter disgrace, one of the gravest possible insults imaginable in that era of diplomacy. This calculated insult ignited a fury that launched one of the most devastating military campaigns in all of recorded human history. Genghis Khan personally led an army of more than 100,000 seasoned troops across treacherous, icy mountain passes in order to annihilate the entire Khwarezmian Empire completely and permanently. The once great cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, glittering centers of learning, art, and international trade, were leveled almost entirely. Millions of people across the region were killed in the campaign, and ancient irrigation systems that had taken over 1,000 years to develop and perfect were deliberately destroyed forever, turning once fertile farmland into barren desert that has never fully recovered to this day. According to surviving historical accounts, the Mongols executed the corrupt governor of Otrar by pouring molten silver directly into his eyes and ears, a punishment seemingly designed to match precisely the nature of his original greed. The scale of destruction across Central Asia during this single campaign is almost impossible for modern audiences to fully comprehend. Some contemporary chroniclers, likely exaggerating for dramatic effect, but still reflecting genuine horror, claimed that entire regions of Persia did not recover their pre-invasion population levels for several centuries afterward. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years as centers of poetry, mathematics, and astronomy were reduced to rubble within mere days of the Mongol army's arrival at their gates. Genghis Khan personally interrogated captured scholars and engineers before deciding their fate, often sparing those whose specialized knowledge could be put to practical use back in his growing empire. Many Persian and Central Asian artisans, doctors, and astronomers were forcibly relocated eastward, where their expertise would later contribute significantly to scientific and administrative advances under his successors throughout the empire's long history. The Khwarezmian campaign also demonstrated a chilling new dimension of Mongol warfare, the deliberate use of mass terror as a tool of long-term pacification rather than simple short-term revenge. By ensuring that survivors fled westward, carrying horrifying tales of the destruction they had witnessed, Genghis Khan effectively weaponized fear itself, ensuring that future cities lying directly in his army's path would already be half defeated psychologically long before a single Mongol soldier ever came within sight of their walls. The destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire also permanently altered the regional balance of power across the entire Islamic world. Persia, once a unified and formidable power capable of resisting outside invasion for centuries, would remain politically fragmented for generations afterward, a vacuum of authority that later rulers, including Hulagu's own descendants, would struggle for decades to fully fill. This campaign also marked an important turning point in Mongol strategy itself, the moment conquest shifted from simple plunder and revenge towards something resembling deliberate, calculated empire building. Genghis Khan began installing loyal administrators in conquered territories, rather than simply withdrawing after looting them, planting the earliest seeds of the vast governing bureaucracy his grandsons would later inherit and dramatically expand across 2 entire continents. The single deadliest weapon in the entire Mongol arsenal was not a sword, nor was it any siege engine. It was the composite recurve bow, a masterwork of layered horn, wood, and sinew, capable of piercing enemy armor from a distance of over 300 meters, a range and raw power that European, Persian, and Chinese archers of the era simply could not hope to match. Each individual Mongol horseman traveled into battle with 3 to 4 spare horses in tow, swapping mounts continuously while riding at full gallop, which allowed entire armies to cover hundreds of kilometers in a single day, far faster than any rival military force could manage anywhere on the planet at that time. This astonishing mobility let the Mongols appear where no enemy expected them, again and again. When food supplies ran critically short during long marches, Mongol warriors would cut a small vein in their horse's neck and drink the blood directly, often mixed with fermented mare's milk known as airag, without ever needing to stop, dismount, or make camp. Speed was survival on these campaigns, and survival itself had become the very core of their strategy. One of their most devastatingly effective battlefield tactics was the so-called feigned retreat, in which Mongol riders would pretend to break formation and flee the field in apparent panic, luring overconfident enemy cavalry to chase them out of their defensive lines, only to suddenly wheel back around in perfect coordination and surround the now scattered enemy completely from every direction at once. But perhaps their single greatest weapon of all was purely psychological: terror itself. If a city chose to surrender peacefully without resistance, its population was often largely spared from slaughter and simply absorbed into the empire. But if that same city dared to resist, every single person and animal inside would be ruthlessly slaughtered as a deliberate warning to the very next city down the road. Word of Mongol brutality spread across entire continents faster than their armies could ever physically travel, and as a direct result, many cities simply surrendered the moment word arrived, long before a single Mongol horseman ever appeared at their gates. Mongol intelligence gathering was equally sophisticated and often underappreciated by historians focused purely on battlefield tactics. Before any major campaign, scouts and merchant spies would map out enemy roads, water sources, and city defenses in extraordinary detail, sometimes over a period of years rather than mere months. Genghis Khan reportedly studied reports on his enemies with the same intensity a modern general might study satellite imagery, refusing to commit his forces until he understood his opponent's weaknesses completely. Mongol commanders also relied heavily on a tactic known as the tulukhma, or standard sweep, in which separate columns of cavalry would advance across a wide front, appearing to enemy scouts as scattered, disorganized raiding parties, only to converge with devastating precision at a single predetermined point on the battlefield, catching defenders completely off guard, despite having apparently weeks of advance warning of the approaching army. Even Mongol clothing and equipment reflected this relentless focus on speed and self-sufficiency. Each warrior carried multiple changes of clothing, cooking pots, fishing line, and basic repair tools, allowing armies to operate independently across hostile territory for months at a time, without requiring the slow, vulnerable supply trains that crippled the mobility of nearly every rival military force of the era. Mongol commanders also showed unusual willingness to absorb and deploy foreign technology whenever it proved useful, including Chinese gunpowder weapons, Persian siege engineers, and even Korean naval techniques in later campaigns. This pragmatic openness to outside innovation, rather than rigid adherence to traditional steppe warfare alone, allowed the Mongols to continuously evolve their tactics across wildly different terrains and enemies throughout decades of relentless, near-continuous conquest. Discipline on the march was reinforced through an elaborate system of hunting drives, massive organized hunts in which thousands of mounted warriors would form an enormous circle many kilometers wide, slowly driving wild game toward a central killing ground. These exercises, conducted regularly even during peacetime, served as both practical training in coordinated maneuver and a powerful symbolic rehearsal for the encirclement tactics that would later devastate so many enemy armies across Asia and Europe alike. After thoroughly conquering Central Asia, Genghis Khan turned his weary but undefeated army back toward China once more, this time intending to crush the kingdom of Xia, which had betrayed its sworn alliance by refusing to send promised reinforcements during his earlier campaigns when he needed them most desperately. During this particular campaign, the aging conqueror, by now well into his 60s, suffered a serious fall from his horse and sustained severe internal injuries that would have ended a lesser man's career on the spot. True to the character he had displayed his entire life, he refused to stop, continuing to personally command the ongoing war effort until his very final breath left his body. Genghis Khan finally died in August of the year 1227, somewhere in the rugged mountains of what is now China. The exact circumstances still debated by historians to this very day. Before his death, he issued one final crucial order: that news of his passing be kept absolutely secret until the kingdom of Xia had been completely and utterly destroyed, ensuring his enemies could take no comfort or courage from the news of his death. According to surviving historical accounts, in order to keep the precise location of his tomb permanently hidden from the world, his personal honor guard killed every single person and animal they happened to encounter along the entire funeral procession route to the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, leaving no living witness behind to ever reveal the secret. They are further said to have used 1,000 horses to deliberately trample the entire burial site completely flat, and even diverted the course of a nearby river to flow directly over the grave itself, ensuring that absolutely no one would ever be able to locate the final resting place of the man who had so thoroughly reshaped the known world. To this very day, despite extensive modern searches using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, the tomb of Genghis Khan has never once been found. The sheer scale of his conquests by the time of his death is staggering to consider, even by modern standards. In just over 2 decades of continuous warfare, Genghis Khan had personally overseen the conquest of more territory than any single individual in human history, before or since. An empire stretching from the Sea of Japan in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west, encompassing dozens of distinct cultures, languages, and religions, under one centralized military command structure. Before his death, he had also carefully divided his vast territories among his 4 sons, hoping to prevent the kind of catastrophic succession war that had destroyed so many empires before his own. Jochi, his eldest son, whose paternity was clouded by rumor due to his mother's earlier kidnapping by the Merkits, received lands in the far west. Chagatai received Central Asia. Ögedei, his chosen successor as Great Khan, received authority over the empire's core administration, and Tolui, the youngest, traditionally inherited the original Mongol homeland itself, along with the bulk of his father's personal army. This careful division of power, intended as a safeguard against chaos, would instead plant the seeds of decades of future rivalry between competing branches of the royal family, rivalries that would eventually fracture the empire from within, even as its armies continued conquering new territory abroad. Even in death, Genghis Khan's influence over Mongol identity remained absolute. Future generations of Khans, regardless of how far their territories spread or how many foreign customs they adopted, continued to invoke his name and his original laws as the ultimate source of their legitimacy, treating the Yasa almost as sacred scripture, even centuries after the man who wrote it had vanished into an unmarked grave somewhere in the mountains of his homeland. Modern researchers have used satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and even DNA analysis of soil samples in repeated attempts to locate the tomb, with several international expeditions launched over the past few decades alone. So far, every single search has come back empty-handed, a fitting final mystery for a man who spent his entire life ensuring that nothing, not even death itself, would ever be allowed to diminish his absolute control over his own legacy. Before his death, Genghis Khan had carefully chosen his third son, Ögedei, as his official successor. Not because he was necessarily the most fearsome warrior among his many sons, but because he was widely regarded as the most capable diplomat, particularly skilled at resolving bitter internal conflicts within both the royal family and the wider empire as a whole. Ögedei Khan went on to build the Mongols' very first permanent capital city, named Karakorum, a remarkable transformation that turned a once purely nomadic empire into something possessing real administrative structure and a fixed, stable seat of central power for the very first time in its history. He then dispatched his single most brilliant military commander, the legendary general Subutai, to lead an enormous invasion force deep into the territories of Russia and onward into the heart of Europe itself, launching a campaign that would soon terrify two entire continents simultaneously. The Mongols turned the brutal European winter into a decisive military advantage that few local armies had ever previously considered exploiting. They used the frozen, ice-covered rivers of Russia as natural highways, allowing their fast-moving cavalry to strike unsuspecting cities at incredible speed across terrain that would have been completely impassable swampland during any other season of the year. The great city of Kiev was burned entirely to the ground in the year 1240, following a brutal and prolonged siege involving massed catapults and devastating incendiary weapons. The triumphant Mongol army then pushed steadily forward into Poland and Hungary, annihilating tens of thousands of assembled European knights and soldiers at the decisive battles of Legnica and Mohi within the very same year. The Battle of Legnica, fought in Poland, saw a combined force of Polish knights, German Templars, and Teutonic Order soldiers utterly destroyed by a Mongol army roughly equal in size, but vastly superior in coordination and tactical flexibility. European heavy cavalry, slow and rigid in their formations, proved almost helpless against an enemy that could fire arrows at a full gallop while retreating, then wheel back for a devastating counterattack within minutes. Just 2 days later, hundreds of kilometers away, at the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, an even larger European force suffered an equally catastrophic defeat. King Bela IV barely escaped with his life, as his entire army was encircled and slaughtered, with Mongol commanders reportedly using captured prisoners and even gunpowder-based incendiary weapons, technology borrowed from their earlier Chinese campaigns, to terrify and disorient them. Defenders before the final assault began. What made this twin victory especially remarkable was the sheer distance involved. The two Mongol armies that struck Poland and Hungary were operating thousands of kilometers apart from their original base, yet still managed to coordinate their timing within days of one another, a logistical achievement that genuinely stunned European military observers, who could not comprehend how such precision was possible without modern communication technology of any kind. European chroniclers at the time struggled even to properly identify their attackers, often confusing the Mongols with the biblical Tartarus, the depths of hell itself, a linguistic accident that gave rise to the lasting term Tatar, still used today, despite referring to an entirely different and much older ethnic group from the one actually leading the devastating invasion across the continent. General Subutai himself remains one of the most underappreciated military commanders in world history. Born a commoner, the son of a blacksmith, he rose entirely on merit to become arguably the single most successful field commander of the entire Mongol conquest, personally overseeing campaigns that conquered more territory than any other general in human history, stretching from Korea in the Far East to the gates of Vienna in the heart of Europe. a record that remains unmatched even to this day. By the very end of the year 1241, advancing Mongol cavalry units had already reached the immediate outskirts of Vienna itself. All of Western Europe stood frozen in genuine, paralyzing fear, with seemingly no remaining military force anywhere on the continent capable of meaningfully stopping the relentless advance. No European commander of the era truly understood the sophisticated, coordinated, multi-pronged tactics that the Mongols employed so effectively, communicating across vast distances using elaborate systems of flag signals and carefully arranged smoke columns. Europe genuinely seemed to be facing total, unstoppable catastrophe within a matter of mere weeks. And then, almost unbelievably, a single messenger arrived from the distant east. Word finally reached General Subutai command tent that Great Khan Ögedei had suddenly died back in Mongolia, reportedly as a direct result of years of excessive drinking that had steadily ruined his health. Under the strict, unbending laws of the Yasa, every single commander and royal relative throughout the entire empire was legally required to immediately abandon any ongoing campaign and return at once to the capital in order to personally participate in the Kurultai and help select a worthy new Great Khan. This sudden, almost miraculous withdrawal of Mongol forces from the gates of Vienna ultimately saved the whole of Western Europe from what would very likely have been complete and total devastation, marking one of the single most consequential twists of fate in the entirety of recorded world history. Historians have long debated whether the Mongols truly possessed the strength to conquer the whole of Western Europe had they continued their advance. Some argue the campaign was already losing momentum due to stretched supply lines and unfamiliar terrain, far removed from the open grasslands their cavalry depended upon for maximum effectiveness. Others maintain that General Subutai, widely regarded as one of history's most brilliant military minds, could likely have adapted his tactics successfully, just as he had already done repeatedly across Russia, Persia, and the Caucasus during previous campaigns spanning more than a decade of continuous warfare. What remains undeniable is the sheer psychological devastation left behind across the continent. Entire regions of Hungary and Poland lay depopulated for years afterward, with some chronicles describing fields left completely unplanted because there simply were not enough surviving farmers left to work them. Refugees fleeing westward carried tales of Mongol brutality that would shape European fears and folklore regarding the so-called Tatar hordes for many generations to come. The withdrawal also revealed something crucial about the underlying nature of the Mongol political system itself, that even at the absolute height of their military power, succession law and internal political stability still took precedence over any single ongoing foreign conquest, no matter how successful or how close to total victory that campaign might yet have been. For centuries afterward, European writers and rulers continued to live in fear of a second Mongol invasion, fortifying cities and maintaining standing armies they otherwise might not have needed. Some historians even argue that the trauma of this near catastrophe quietly accelerated certain political and military reforms across fragmented medieval Europe, as rulers scrambled to ensure they would never again be caught so dangerously unprepared against an enemy from the distant east. Some historians have also speculated about an alternate history, where Ögedei lived just a few years longer. Had the withdrawal not occurred when it did, Subutai's combined forces, fresh off 2 consecutive crushing victories, faced almost no organized opposition standing between them and the heartlands of France and the Holy Roman Empire. the entire trajectory of European history, religion, and political development might have unfolded in a dramatically different direction had a single Mongol ruler simply lived a little longer back in distant Karakorum. Ögedei's unexpected death plunged the vast Mongol Empire into roughly 5 long years of political paralysis, as rival branches of the sprawling royal family fought bitterly and openly over who would rightfully inherit ultimate supreme power. Eventually, Guyuk, the son of Ögedei, was formally elevated to the position of Great Khan after considerable maneuvering, but he died under deeply mysterious and still unresolved circumstances shortly after finally taking power, well before he could properly consolidate his authority over the fractured empire. Supreme authority then shifted entirely away from Ögedei's branch of the family, passing instead to the descendants of Temüjin, the youngest son of Genghis Khan. In the year 1251, Möngke was formally elected as the new Great Khan, following a fiercely contested Kurultai. Möngke quickly proved himself to be an exceptionally ruthless and decisive ruler in every respect. He carried out a sweeping and brutal purge of his political rivals across the empire, executing numerous high-ranking nobles in order to firmly secure his own grip on power and eliminate any future potential challenge to his throne before it could even form. He then devised an entirely new and ambitious strategic vision for the next phase of conquest, deliberately splitting future military campaigns into 2 separate fronts. His brother, Hulagu, was sent westward to conquer the heart of the Middle East, while his other brother, Kublai, was simultaneously tasked with completing the long-delayed conquest of southern China. The 5-year interregnum following Ögedei's death had revealed deep structural weaknesses within the empire's succession system, weaknesses that troubled Möngke deeply once he finally secured the throne for himself. Without a clear, undisputed line of inheritance, every transition of power risked descending into exactly this kind of prolonged paralysis, leaving conquered territories vulnerable to rebellion and foreign powers time to regroup and rebuild their defenses. Möngke responded to this danger with characteristic ruthlessness, ordering a sweeping investigation into the conduct of regional governors across the empire, many of whom had grown corrupt and abusive during the years of weak central authority. Officials found guilty of excessive corruption or cruelty toward conquered populations were executed without mercy, a move that, while brutal, genuinely improved administrative conditions for millions of ordinary subjects living under Mongol rule throughout Persia, Russia, and northern China alike. He also commissioned a comprehensive empire-wide census, an extraordinary administrative undertaking for the era, allowing the Mongols to more accurately assess taxation, available manpower, and resources across territories spanning from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the borders of Eastern Europe, a level of bureaucratic sophistication that would have seemed utterly impossible for the loosely organized tribal confederation Genghis Khan had first united barely half a century earlier. Möngke also personally championed continued expansion on 2 fronts simultaneously, a decision that reflected supreme confidence in the empire's military capacity even after years of internal turmoil. Few rulers in history have ever attempted to wage full-scale war against both the Islamic heartlands of the Middle East and the remaining unconquered territories of southern China at exactly the same time, yet Möngke pursued precisely this audacious strategy with characteristic determination. To support these massive undertakings, Möngke also reformed the empire's taxation and supply systems, ensuring that conquered territories contributed troops, grain, and specialized craftsmen toward distant campaigns thousands of kilometers from their own homes. This level of coordinated, empire-wide resource mobilization had no real precedent anywhere else in the medieval world, and it represented, in many ways, the true administrative peak of unified Mongol imperial power before the cracks of division finally became impossible to ignore. Hulagu Khan was personally dispatched to destroy the remaining Islamic heartlands of the Middle East, centered firmly around the magnificent city of Baghdad, which at that time stood as one of the single greatest centers of scientific knowledge and learning found anywhere on the entire planet. Before even reaching the gates of Baghdad itself, the Mongol army first eliminated the infamous secretive order of assassins, methodically besieging and ultimately destroying their seemingly impregnable mountain fortress at Alamut through patient, highly disciplined siege warfare conducted over many months. In the year 1258, Hulagu formally demanded that the reigning caliph of Baghdad surrender his city without resistance. The caliph firmly refused this demand, placing his entire trust in the city's massive defensive walls and in his sincere belief that divine protection would surely save him from any earthly threat. The Mongol army nevertheless breached those supposedly impregnable city walls with relative ease and unleashed an absolutely devastating massacre upon the population, killing somewhere between 80,000 and 200,000 residents of the city over the course of just a few horrific days. The legendary House of Wisdom, a vast and irreplaceable library containing many centuries' worth of accumulated scientific and philosophical knowledge, was burned completely to the ground in the chaos. Tens of thousands of priceless books and manuscripts were thrown directly into the Tigris River, and witnesses at the time claimed the river's water ran visibly black with ink for many days afterward. In order to avoid spilling royal blood directly onto the bare earth, a serious violation of traditional Mongol religious belief, the captured caliph was instead rolled tightly inside a heavy carpet and then trampled to death by horses, a uniquely brutal end that fittingly symbolized the sudden collapse of an entire civilization's intellectual and political capital. The fall of Baghdad sent a wave of pure terror across the entire Islamic world, from Cairo to distant India. For more than 5 centuries, Baghdad had stood as the unrivaled center of the Abbasid Caliphate, a beacon of mathematics, medicine, and philosophy that had preserved and expanded upon the knowledge of ancient Greece, Persia, and India alike during Europe's own darker centuries. Its destruction represented not merely a military defeat, but the violent end of an entire golden age of scholarship that many historians argue the region never fully recovered from. Hulagu's wife, Dokuz Khatun, a devout Nestorian Christian, reportedly urged some restraint regarding the city's substantial Christian population, who were spared the worst of the massacre as a direct result of her intervention. This episode highlights the surprisingly complex religious dynamics within the Mongol royal family itself, where Christian, Buddhist, and shamanist beliefs often coexisted and genuinely influenced political decisions made at the very highest levels of imperial power. Following the conquest, Hulagu went on to establish the Ilkhanate, a new Mongol state covering most of Persia and the surrounding region, which, despite its violent founding, would later evolve into a relatively stable and even culturally sophisticated kingdom, eventually overseeing a genuine revival of Persian art, astronomy, and historical scholarship within just a few short generations. This pattern, devastating initial conquest, followed eventually by cultural revival under Mongol patronage, would repeat itself across several regions of the empire, suggesting that the relationship between Mongol rule and the civilizations it conquered was always far more complex than simple destruction alone. Even in places that had suffered some of the very worst atrocities during the actual moment of conquest itself. As Hulagu Khan busily prepared his very next major campaign an ambitious invasion of Egypt itself, news suddenly arrived from an enormous distance away that Great Khan Möngke had died unexpectedly during an entirely separate military campaign far away in China. Just as had happened once before, back in 1241, Hulagu was now forced to withdraw the overwhelming majority of his army back toward Mongolia to participate in the succession process, leaving behind only a relatively small garrison force of roughly 10,000 troops to hold the entire vast Middle Eastern frontier alone. The disciplined Mamluk army of Egypt, composed largely of former slave soldiers who had personally trained under and intimately understood traditional steppe warfare tactics, immediately recognized this sudden withdrawal as a truly golden strategic opportunity. In the year 1260, at the decisive Battle of Ain Jalut in what is now present-day Israel, the clever Mamluk commanders turned the Mongols' own signature feigned retreat tactic directly against them, successfully luring the overconfident Mongol force into a carefully prepared trap and annihilating it almost completely. This remarkable victory marked the very first time in recorded history that a Mongol army had suffered a decisive defeat it was simply unable to later avenge or reverse, permanently halting any further Mongol expansion southward toward the African continent. The Mamluk victory at Ain Jalut was not simply a matter of luck or numbers. Their commanders, men like Baybars, had spent years studying captured Mongol tactics and had even adopted similar mounted archery techniques themselves, training their own forces to match the speed and precision that had once seemed uniquely unbeatable on any battlefield in the known world. In many ways, the Mamluks defeated the Mongols by becoming, tactically speaking, very much like them. News of this unprecedented defeat spread rapidly across the Islamic world, providing a desperately needed psychological boost to populations who had watched city after city fall without any hope of meaningful resistance for nearly 4 decades. Ain Jalut proved decisively that the Mongol war machine, however terrifying, was not, in fact, invincible, and that disciplined, well-prepared opponents could indeed turn the tables under the right circumstances. Hulagu reportedly wished to avenge this humiliating defeat immediately, but ongoing political tensions with his own cousin Möngke Khan, ruler of the rival Golden Horde in Russia, who had controversially converted to Islam, prevented him from ever gathering sufficient forces for a renewed southern campaign. This marked the first open warfare between separate branches of the Mongol royal family itself, a clear sign that the unified empire Genghis Khan had built was already beginning to genuinely fracture from within. The general Baybars, who had commanded Mamluk forces at Ain Jalut, would soon afterward assassinate his own sultan and seize power for himself, going on to become one of the most celebrated rulers in Egyptian history, remembered as the man who twice defended his homeland against existential foreign threats, first against the Mongols and later against the remaining Crusader states clinging to the eastern Mediterranean coastline. Ain Jalut also carries enormous symbolic weight in modern historical memory across the Arab world, often remembered as the moment a relatively young and embattled Muslim power proved that even the most feared military force on earth could be matched and beaten through preparation, discipline, and a genuine willingness to learn from a terrifying enemy rather than simply fear them from a distance. As the once unified Mongol Empire gradually began fracturing into 4 largely independent khanates, Kublai Khan formally declared himself the new Great Khan, and turned his complete and undivided attention toward finally finishing the long-delayed conquest of all of China. The ongoing war against the southern Song dynasty proved to be exceptionally difficult and frustrating for the Mongols. The terrain throughout southern China was densely covered with rivers, flooded rice paddies, and thick forests. Terrain where traditional Mongol cavalry simply could not operate with anything close to its usual devastating effectiveness on open ground. Kublai therefore completely revised his overall military strategy, building an entirely new and substantial Mongol navy from scratch, and deploying massive siege trebuchets specifically designed by skilled Arab engineers in order to finally smash through the formidable fortified cities of southern China one by one. In the year 1279, the long-resistant Song dynasty finally collapsed completely, and Kublai Khan became the very first foreign-born ruler in all of Chinese history to successfully control the entirety of China under a single unified government. He proceeded to establish an entirely new ruling dynasty named Yuan, moved the imperial capital permanently to the city of Beijing, and deliberately styled himself as a traditional Chinese emperor, a calculated political move designed specifically to win the lasting loyalty of his many new Chinese subjects and reduce the ongoing risk of organized rebellion against his rule. Kublai Khan's reign represented a genuine fusion of Mongol military tradition with Chinese administrative sophistication, a combination that proved remarkably effective for several decades. He restored and expanded the Grand Canal, reformed the postal relay system inherited from his grandfather, and promoted the use of paper currency throughout his territories, a financial innovation that left visiting European travelers utterly astonished, since nothing comparable existed anywhere in their own homelands at the time. Despite ruling as a Chinese emperor in name and ceremony, Kublai never fully abandoned his Mongol identity or his nomadic roots. He maintained a separate summer capital at Chengdu, immortalized centuries later in English poetry as Xanadu, where he could still hunt on horseback and live according to traditional steppe customs whenever the formal demands of Chinese imperial court life grew too restrictive for his taste. His rule, however, was not without serious resentment from his new subjects. Many ethnic Chinese scholars and former Song officials viewed the entire Yuan dynasty as a foreign occupation, regardless of how thoroughly Kublai adopted Chinese customs. A deep cultural tension that would simmer beneath the surface for the better part of a century, before eventually exploding into open, organized rebellion. Kublai also formally established a strict social hierarchy under Yuan rule, placing Mongols and other foreign allies above native Chinese subjects in matters of law, taxation, and access to government positions. While this system helped the Mongol minority maintain control over a vastly larger Chinese population in the short term, it also guaranteed lasting resentment that would eventually outlast the dynasty itself by many generations. Despite this resentment, Kublai's court became a genuine magnet for talent and ideas from across the known world, hosting Persian astronomers, Tibetan Buddhist monks, Nestorian Christian priests, and European travelers like Marco Polo, all within the same sprawling capital. Few rulers in history have presided over such a genuinely cosmopolitan court, one where a dozen different languages might be spoken in a single audience hall on any given afternoon. Never fully satisfied with the already enormous extent of his accumulated power, Kublai Khan next set his ambitious sights on the island nation of Japan. He sent formal envoys demanding immediate surrender, but the proud Japanese samurai responded decisively by beheading the unfortunate messengers and sending absolutely nothing back in reply. In the year 1274, the assembled Mongol navy launched its very first invasion of Japan, But the invading fleet was struck by an unexpectedly violent storm during the night, sinking many of their ships and forcing a hasty, humiliating withdrawal back across the sea. Refusing to simply accept this initial defeat, Kublai assembled the single largest naval invasion force ever seen in human history up to that point, in the year 1281. An enormous fleet of roughly 4,000 ships carrying approximately 140,000 soldiers in total. Just as fierce fighting was raging brutally along the Japanese coastline, an enormous and unusually powerful typhoon struck the fleet completely without warning, destroying more than 80% of the entire Mongol invasion force and sending it permanently to the bottom of the surrounding sea. The Japanese people firmly believed this devastating storm represented direct divine intervention on their behalf, and they subsequently named it kamikaze, meaning quite literally, divine wind. This catastrophic and humiliating failure permanently shattered the long-standing myth that the Mongol military could simply never be defeated under any circumstances. The failed invasions of Japan exposed a fundamental weakness that had remained largely hidden during decades of overwhelming continental conquest: the Mongols' relative inexperience with naval warfare and their consistent underestimation of weather as a genuine military adversary in its own right. Unlike the open steppe or even the river systems of China, the open ocean offered no terrain advantage their cavalry tactics could ever hope to exploit. The financial and human cost of these two failed campaigns was staggering for the Yuan treasury, draining resources that might otherwise have funded further consolidation within China itself, or addressed growing unrest among Kublai's already skeptical Chinese subjects. Some modern historians argue that the Japanese campaigns marked the true turning point where Mongol expansion definitively shifted from seemingly unstoppable conquest toward gradual, irreversible overextension. Kublai reportedly considered a third invasion attempt in later years, but his advisors, citing the catastrophic losses already suffered and growing instability much closer to home, eventually convinced him to abandon the idea permanently. Japan would remain the one major regional power that the Mongol Empire, at the absolute peak of its global military strength, simply proved unable to conquer. This failure carried enormous symbolic weight for Japanese national identity for centuries afterward, reinforcing a powerful belief in divine protection of the home islands that would resurface, controversially, many centuries later during the Second World War, when the very same word, kamikaze, was revived to describe a very different and far more tragic form of desperate, sacrificial defense. Modern marine archaeologists have since located the wreckage of several Mongol invasion vessels off the coast of Japan, providing physical confirmation of contemporary accounts and revealing fascinating engineering details about 13th century Mongol and Chinese shipbuilding techniques, offering a rare, tangible link to a campaign that, for centuries, existed primarily through written legend and oral tradition alone. Despite the staggering and undeniable brutality involved in nearly every Mongol conquest, their ultimate rule across such a vast territory eventually produced something genuinely unexpected: a sustained period of relative peace known as the Pax Mongolica, which allowed global trade to flourish on a scale never previously seen anywhere in recorded history. The Mongols came to control the entire length of the legendary Silk Road and stationed organized guards along its many routes, finally allowing merchants to travel safely all the way from Europe to East Asia without serious fear of bandit attacks for the first time in many centuries. They also built an extraordinarily efficient international messaging network known as the YAM, featuring well-organized relay stations roughly every 40 kilometers along major routes, which allowed urgent messages to travel up to 300 kilometers in a single day, an astonishing speed for the era. The famous Venetian merchant Marco Polo personally travelled along this very network and reportedly served within Kublai Khan's own royal court for as long as 17 years, later bringing back fantastic tales of the empire's incredible wealth and sophistication to a largely disbelieving Europe. Cultural and technological exchange exploded rapidly across the entire empire during this period. Gunpowder and paper currency travelled steadily westward from China, while advanced mathematics and astronomy from the Arab world flowed back eastward into China in return, fundamentally reshaping both civilizations. The Mongols also practiced a remarkable degree of religious tolerance for their era, something almost unheard of elsewhere in the medieval world. Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, and Taoist clergy were all formally exempted from taxation and openly permitted to debate freely and respectfully within the royal court itself. This era of relative stability also transformed the European understanding of the wider world in ways that would echo for centuries afterward. Maps produced in Venice and Genoa during this period suddenly began including accurate details of Central Asia and China. The very first time, information gathered directly from merchants and missionaries who could now travel the entire length of the Silk Road in relative safety, thanks to Mongol protection along the route. Even diseases and agricultural products spread more efficiently across this newly interconnected world. Crops, livestock breeds, and medical knowledge moved freely between civilizations that had previously known almost nothing of one another, creating what some modern historians describe as an early precursor to globalization itself, centuries before European maritime exploration would eventually connect the entire planet by sea instead of by overland caravan routes. Diplomatic contact even extended as far as Western Europe, where Mongol envoys explored potential alliances with Christian kingdoms against their shared Muslim rivals in the Middle East, though these ambitious negotiations ultimately never produced any lasting military partnership. Still, the very fact that such distant communication was even possible speaks to just how thoroughly the Mongol Empire had genuinely reshaped global connectivity within the span of only a few short decades. Historians today often describe this period as the first true age of globalization, centuries before the term itself was ever invented. Ideas, technologies, and even artistic styles traveled distances that would previously have taken many generations to cross, compressed instead into the span of a single human lifetime, under the relative security the Mongols had imposed across their vast and varied territories. The very same vast trade networks that had once brought the empire such extraordinary wealth eventually became the empire's undoing as well. The devastating Black Death plague travelled steadily along established Mongol merchant routes, carried unknowingly by trading ships moving from Asia all the way into Europe. The plague ultimately killed many millions of people across both China and Europe, and the once thriving economic engine of the Silk Road collapsed almost entirely as international trade ground to a complete halt, and once bustling cities emptied of the living in horrifying numbers. In the 1350s, China itself was struck by devastating droughts and severe flooding along the Yellow River, compounded further by rampant, widespread corruption among local Mongol officials. These overlapping crises together finally ignited the famous Red Turban Rebellion among an increasingly desperate Chinese population. In the year 1368, a former peasant named Zhu Yuanzhang successfully led a rebel army that thoroughly crushed the remaining Mongol forces, driving them entirely out of the imperial capital at Beijing and founding the new Ming dynasty firmly in their place. Zhu Yuanzhang's rise was itself an extraordinary story. Born into desperate poverty, orphaned by famine and plague, and once a wandering Buddhist monk begging for food along dusty roads. He rose through the ranks of the Red Turban Rebellion through sheer cunning and battlefield skill, eventually outmaneuvering rival rebel factions just as ruthlessly as he outmaneuvered the Mongol garrisons themselves. His journey from beggar to emperor mirrored in strange and almost poetic fashion the very same path Temüjin had once walked over a century and a half earlier, on the opposite end of the social ladder. The Mongol retreat from China was not the sudden, total collapse some popular accounts suggest. Remnants of the Yuan court fled north and continued to rule a reduced steppe kingdom, later known to historians as the Northern Yuan, for several more decades, still claiming the title of legitimate emperors even from their diminished encampments far from the lost splendor of Beijing. Ming armies would launch repeated punitive expeditions deep into Mongolia over the following years, determined to permanently neutralize any lingering threat of a renewed southern invasion. Across the rest of the fractured empire, similar declines unfolded at different speeds and for different reasons. The Golden Horde in Russia gradually lost its grip over the Russian principalities throughout the 15th century, as local princes like those of rising Moscow grew steadily stronger and increasingly less willing to pay tribute to a once feared overlord, whose internal divisions had grown impossible to hide. The Ilkhanate in Persia had already collapsed decades earlier amid succession disputes and economic mismanagement, fracturing into a patchwork of smaller, competing local dynasties. Only the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia endured in any recognizable form, eventually transforming through further conquest into the foundation of new powers like Timur's empire, which would itself claim direct descent from the original Mongol conquerors. The defeated Mongols were forced to retreat back to the very same open grasslands where their entire remarkable story had first begun centuries earlier. The largest land empire in all of human history had finally dissolved completely, leaving behind nothing but the long shadow of its terror and the undeniable scale of everything it had once achieved. Yet the Mongol legacy did not simply vanish along with their empire. Descendants of Genghis Khan continued ruling smaller successor states for generations afterward, including the Crimean Khanate, which would persist for centuries longer, and the Mughal Empire of India, founded by a descendant who proudly traced his lineage directly back to the original conqueror himself. Modern genetic studies have even suggested that a remarkable percentage of men across Asia today carry a Y chromosome lineage strongly associated with Genghis Khan's direct bloodline, a staggering testament to the sheer scale of his dynasty's historical reach. Beyond bloodlines, the practical legacy of the Mongol Empire reshaped the modern world in ways still felt today. Trade networks, diplomatic customs, and even certain administrative practices pioneered under Mongol rule influenced the kingdoms and empires that followed for centuries afterward. From Ming China to Safavid Persia to the rising princedoms of Muscovy that would eventually grow into the Russian Empire. In the end, the story of the Mongols is not simply one of unmatched brutality, though brutality was undeniably part of it. It is also the story of one abandoned, starving boy who refused to accept the fate the steppe had assigned him, and who, through sheer will, ruthless adaptability, and an unshakable belief in loyalty, earned rather than inherited, built a connected world the likes of which had never existed before, and arguably has never fully existed in quite the same way since.